Okay. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and we continue second half of our second day, and our presenter is now Ron Ross. Probably Ron is the person who does not require introduction. Everybody who deal with business rules know who Ron is. I would just add that over many years, Ron always represents business side of rules management and is trying to keep our IT obsession as low as possible and let business people to express their logic. And sometimes it creates some difficulties because technical people don't like certain questions what Ron usually asks, but that's why I always like to have Ron among our presenters. And I'm sure today we will hear interesting things. Ron, take the floor.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you, Sandy. It's great to be here. I've really enjoyed yesterday and this morning. I hope I can add a little bit to the conference. First of all, let me clarify what Jacob said that I do for a living. I'm not an industry analyst. I'm not a software developer. I'm not an academic. Basically, I'm just an innovator with a practical interest in trying to solve business problems as I see them. And I've stuck with that for 45 years, so probably I'll be sticking with it a little longer, let's hope. I'm grateful to be here today. It's an outstanding group of people. As many of you know, rules are my favorite subject. So today what I want to do is take a hard look at the rule space. And in particular, I want to address 3 questions. Now, I'm going to kindly ask everyone but Denis to hold questions until the end. Denis is allowed, because he's a special person with good questions, he's allowed to ask questions as I go. I'll leave that up to you, Sandy.
I'm special for once.
Yeah, no, but you have to keep yourself on mute. Question 1, have we made significant progress? That's one is easy. You know, absolutely we have, and I will be the first to say it and emphasize it. Decisions and DMN have made major contributions to the industry. Good stuff has happened as a result of that. People have really pushed the ball forward. And I'm pretty sure that everyone here agrees with that point. So I'm not going to dwell on it other than just to make sure that I have said it and said it clearly. So question 2, I would have thought that by 2021, everybody in the world would be using business rules and rule tools, but they're not. And I ask myself, why is that? Could it be that the tools the industry has offered haven't provided all the solutions that business needs? Well, I'm going to share some thoughts with you today that I think the answer is no. We haven't provided all the solutions that we need to. But I do want to be positive and stay constructive. There are definitely major opportunities here for us to seize on. I think we had not even close to yet achieve the full potential of rules. There's a lot more good stuff to come. So I want to take a hard look at the matter together, and you know, we can put our heads together on that today and think it through. So question 3, what are some of the remaining challenges, the remaining business challenges that sort of bleed over into technical challenges that rule platforms need to address? And today I'll give you my 3-part answer to that question. I believe the big opportunities for rule platforms are, first, to eliminate programmer workload. Second, to address sentiment and human discretion better. And third, to tie in more directly to business governance and knowledge expression. Now, I actually spend most of my time today, it's limited, talking about just that first point, eliminating programmer workload. And the workload doesn't really come from where you necessarily think it does. You know, today, of course, we can automate decisions really well. We've heard about that in the conference. So where does programmer workload still come from in supporting business logic? And I'm not just talking about the technical side here. And how can rule tools help? Now let's explore that question by looking at an example. And here is a sample rule. It's a rule that I've used as an example for a long time. A customer must be assigned to an agent if the customer has placed an order. And as I always do with business rules, I've expressed the rule in purely declarative manner, so it doesn't include any particular process or procedure or other means to enforce or apply it. It's completely independent of any process or procedure. So ask yourself, why would I need any process or procedure whatsoever to enforce this rule? A human can understand and enforce it properly without any reference to a process model. So why not a machine? And I believe that's exactly where programmer workload comes from today. It comes from building process models and writing code to enforce this kind of rules. And it's a massive workload because there are thousands of rules like this, tens of thousands, probably even more than that. Now, note carefully, as I express this rule, I made no reference whatsoever to any event where it could be potentially violated or needs to be evaluated. The business rule does not, for example, say, when a customer places an order, then do something. That observation is extremely important for the following reason. When a customer places an order is not the only event when the business rule could potentially be violated and therefore needs to be evaluated. There's another event, kind of event, when this business rule could be violated, and that is when an agent leaves our company. There's the agent there. He's sitting out on the beach in Florida, the Caribbean, or Hawaii. He just retired, and he left his assigned customers high and dry. Now the business rule is violated. The state of the business is in a state of inconsistency. So the business rule needs to be evaluated at that kind of event as well. So in other words, what I'm saying is, and this is a pretty simple example, it could be potentially violated doing two quite distinct kinds of operational business event. The first, when a customer places an order, that's pretty obvious. I think anybody would probably catch that. But the second, when an agent leaves our company, might be much less so. And there's a lot bigger chance that it might be missed by analysts or developers or not treated whatsoever. But both events are nonetheless important because either could produce a violation to this rule. Now, I call these clear-cut events the business rules flashpoints. In other words, those are events that occur however it is that you maintain state within your solution that need to be identified and responded to because a violation of the rule can occur. Now, in thinking about this rule, you might want to ask yourself, since I'm at a DecisionCAMP conference, what business decision does that second flashpoint correspond to when an agent leaves our company? It's just something that happens. I mean, the guy made a personal decision, but there's not any business logic associated with that, no business decision. I mean, maybe you could invent one, and I've seen some pretty clever attempts, but it wouldn't be very natural from a business point of view. So ask yourself this follow-on question: What in current IT approaches and tools ensures you'll get consistent results for the rule, and we're taking a rule-first approach here, across all the processes and procedures and use cases and ad hoc human worker activity, in other words, unmodeled business activity? What is going to guarantee that you get consistent results for the rule across all the flashpoints where it might be violated? And unfortunately, today, the answer is almost always nothing. There are no guarantees. And in fact, in many, many cases, it's unlikely. If the job gets done at all, it's a job for programmers. In other words, it's programmer workload. And since it's a programmer responsibility or a software developer responsibility, it's error prone. It produces brittle systems that are hard to maintain, especially when the rules change, which of course they will. Now, pardon my French here, Denis, but this is one big reason, frankly, why data quality sucks in most organizations. It's flashpoints that have not been properly treated for these kinds of rules. So what we need to do is to stand back and look at the whole rule space and just kind of rethink it. And the example suggests, from a business perspective, there are actually two distinct kinds of rules. Now, decision rules fall into the first category. Those are definitional rules. Decision rules, of course, fundamentally important. We all believe that. That's why we're here at this conference. But there is a second significant major category of rules which are crucial to people and organizations and business activity. And the OMG standard SBVR calls them behavioral business rules because they are about the behavior of people, organizations, and similar activity. Behavioral rules govern the conduct of ongoing activity. Now, that's a very important point, that ongoing activity bit. And let me use soccer to illustrate that. And of course, by soccer, I mean the real football, of course. So football has crucial behavioral rules like offsides and no tackling from behind and similar rules. And how are those rules evaluated? How are they enforced? Well, there's a referee. There's 3 referees, but 1 on the field, continuously watching the ongoing activity and judging in real time when there's a violation of the rule. Now, there's no process model whatsoever for playing a game of football. You know, what a strange thing that would sort of be. Instead, football features referees, and in this presentation, I'm going to call them watchers. Watchers who are external to the activity and able to interrupt it at any time. Now, this is really important because you want to detect violations of these behavioral rules in real time, because if you don't detect them and respond to them in real time, you simply will not get the results that you want. In fact, what will happen is that the violation will compound itself as the game continues, as you go downstream, and the consequences just get worse and worse. And by then, it's too late to do anything about it because the harm has been done, the foul's been committed, but not compensated for. And that is exactly the problem with data quality and similar kinds of issues, which of course impacts decisions directly. So to summarize, with definitional rules, the first category, you can't break them. They might be bad rules or they might be wrong rules, but they are just what they say they are. They can't be directly violated. It makes no sense. But behavioral rules, you can break them. They can be violated, usually at multiple events, at multiple flashpoints, as in our earlier example. Why can they be violated? Because it's people and organizations involved. You can think of behavioral rules very roughly as business constraints, very roughly. Now, do we happen to be talking about some rare case here? No, not at all. This example is not atypical or unusual in any way at all. Our company, Business Rule Solutions, has been doing business rule projects now for over 25 years. We've done many hundreds of projects all across the globe. Some of them, some of the projects we've captured 10,000 rules more. And I can tell you these kind of rules are not rare at all. I'm willing to say that well over 50% of all the rules that we capture are like this. Now, respectfully, I would, if you don't see these kind of rules, I would suggest it's because your approach is focusing so heavily on other aspects, decisions, for example, that you're sort of tripping over your own feet. So our approach doesn't restrict itself just to decision rules. It looks at behavioral rules in equal measure. I guess that's partly because our interest is in the larger problem of business governance and knowledge representation and all these natural kinds of sources of rules. I'll have a few more words to say about that later on. A case study that's been widely discussed from SBVR is URent. Some of you probably have run across it. And you simply can't do URent properly without a very healthy dose of behavioral rules. Here is a partial concept model for URent. A concept model is the basis for a glossary, a structured business vocabulary. And I do want to commend Denis for talking about that and emphasizing the importance. Put a really brave foot forward there. I can only second it. I'm not going to dwell on that. I'll leave it to you to continue that. Jacob as well emphasized the importance of glossary. You just can't, you're kidding yourself if you think you can do any kind of serious rule work at scale that's reusable and robust without a vocabulary and glossary. In other words, without semantics. You're just kidding yourself. But that's a story for another day, and I won't dwell on that more. By the way, this particular example with a complete set of behavioral business rules comes from my new book, Business Knowledge Blueprints, Enabling Your Data to Speak the Language of the Business. And it's in Appendix 3 if you're interested in looking that up. And I've included here, just for the sake of visualization, some other samples of behavioral rules here from URent, just to give you a flavor. And by the way, these just barely scratch the surface. Like I say, very basic, very common, very natural to business people. So let's come back to flashpoints. And I'll give you another example of that using one of the URent behavioral rules. This particular rule says the reservation holder of a points reservation must be a club member. Now for that rule, if you reduce it, if you parse it carefully, you'll find 4 flashpoints, 4 different events where it could be violated and therefore needs to be evaluated. I won't go through them individually, but you can see there what they are. To identify these would be an extremely useful thing if it can be done automatically. And by the way, there is some precedence for that. It's also an analyst skill that we simply need to have. In general, let me say this, and I've looked literally at tens and tens of thousands of behavioral rules. In general, every behavioral rule in general produces at least 2 flashpoints, but usually not more than 4 or 5 in my experience, if you really have an atomic piece of guidance. So if you ever wonder why legacy systems so often produce such inconsistent results, well, we all know there's a whole lot of reasons for that. But I'm going to add this to the list, and pretty high on my list. And it's because programmers, software developers, are coding and managing both behavioral rules and the flashpoints where they need to be evaluated. To me, that's just not a very smart way to build business systems. And it's certainly not very productive for a programmer workload. So what is the solution for flashpoints and programmer workload and achieving higher levels of business consistency? Well, first, what you need to do in your rule architecture, in your rule platform, is you need to monitor events apart from processes. You need a watcher. You need an independent referee that catches when it is that the play goes out of bounds. You know, you can't rely on the teams, you can't rely on the process to do that. There's just too many rules, there's too much going on, there's too much activity. It needs to be a disconnected part of the problem. And second, you should support automatic evaluation of behavioral rules based on their flashpoints. In other words, you should empower this watcher, which of course is a software component, just like a referee in the game of football, to intervene in processes and put a halt to things until there can be a rectification of the foul that's been committed. Third, you must maintain continuous, unbroken awareness of state. You can't do this without awareness of state. So the watcher must know comprehensively what's happening as hundreds or thousands of events are happening almost simultaneously across dozens or hundreds or even more different processes or different kinds of activity, ad hoc and otherwise. Trying to synchronize events using only process models is just hopeless. I feel very strongly about that, and I will be happy to debate that point. At least it'll be hopelessly complex. I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's too complicated. So what do these capabilities achieve? Reduce programmer workload. Modelers and coders don't need to indicate when and how to evaluate behavioral business rules. Higher business fidelity, and by fidelity, I mean correctness. Correctness of business state being maintained in real time, not after the fact, but in real time across all relevant flashpoints for business rules, behavioral business rules, and more responsive systems, ones that can respond to violations selectively based on human discretion, sentiment, and common sense. Now, I'll talk more about that in just a minute. Overall, it gives the potential for a far better partnership between humans and machines. So now let's highlight the shortcomings of DMN. And from my point of view, from a business point of view, and with the intent to be highly constructive here about the matter. First of all, DMN is completely stateless, so it's blind to flashpoints. It's completely dependent on being told when to evaluate all rules. DMN has no automated watcher standing apart from processes, nothing like that. So rule platforms have to be told when to evaluate rules, usually at a point in a BPM model. Now, to be clear here, when I say state, I mean business state, not software state or system state. But what are the implications for programmer workload? What work is the rule tool offloading if it handles this area? Well, as we look at the list, ask yourself what we're really seeing here. If you're a glass half empty kind of person, they're big holes, but I'd rather be much more constructive about it and say, hey, look, there are huge opportunities. The glass is really half full. So DMN decision models force modelers and coders to indicate when to evaluate all rules and there's no coordination of flashpoints. And that's a lot of work. It's a lot of programming and software development work. Now, don't misunderstand me. It's not meant to be a criticism. In fact, there are a great many situations, use cases, where it's a good thing that the platform is told when to evaluate rules, especially for decisions, whereby waiting to a certain point in a process, you can optimize the results from the decision. And probably a process model is a good way, maybe the best way, to tell how long you should wait in order to optimize your decision. But we're not talking about real time, and we need real time intervention for behavioral rules. So again, I emphasize this point over and over. Behavioral rules, you don't want to let the errors compound themselves, because it's just more work that's created to rectify the problem the longer you wait. It just doesn't work well at all from either a business point of view, worker point of view, or from a software point of view. So DMN's dependence on process models, I'm going to say, I'll stick my neck out here, also subtly encourages a procedural view of the business, confusing business solution versus system model. It's one of my hot buttons, because I think that boundary should always be definitive. Now, I know, Jacob, you're pushing the boundary in very interesting and constructive ways, and you're doing it in a very declarative way. So I'm not going to tell you I have all the answers here, but I do know, as you know, business people, their attention is limited, their precision is limited, their capacity and willingness to think through problems is limited. So you really got to focus on, put a stake in the ground and focus on what's the most important things to you. So, and it is in DMN circles, these system concerns, especially having to do with synchronizing processes, is a very common discussion. It's very high on the stack of issues to be addressed. It's a huge problem. Unfortunately, I don't have too much time to discuss it, but Jacob does a very interesting thing in DM community, and I'll plug it here for him. He has practical problems that he puts out and invites solutions to the problems. So he put out one a year or two ago that talked about this problem of synchronization, and we had some really interesting discussion about it. So might want to reference that if you're interested. Now, here's the biggie. There's no support for natural language in expressing rules. And you're going to need that for behavioral rules, because usually they're just one of a kind. They don't fit into decision tables, or at least they don't fit naturally into decision tables. Now, frankly, and Jan was very instrumental in his presentation, his group's presentation yesterday, in beginning to convince me, hey, messaging is an integral part of any rule solution. And in fact, a problem, and Jan's always ahead of things, or the problem with decision models, just sort of like the relational model in some ways, it's kind of been stripped of semantics and the ability to support messaging queries and responses. And that's a very important direction, because again, workload, this is not stuff that should be offloaded to external bots. This is something that should be brought into play. So, the language you're using for rules is not a natural language. If it has iterative loops, and if it uses the term null, that's not natural language. So yes, that's a little small barb, I guess it feel. In other words, the real world naturally uses language, natural language, for a great many rules. You know, if you don't believe me, just go read any rule book or go read any policy manual or go read any legal document. You know, they're not written in DMN and they never will be. I thought it was kind of interesting, the discussion from Facebook saying that their policies for hate speech and so on, you know, they're written as policies. I really wanted to ask how they were written out, but I can be pretty sure that they weren't expressed by, you know, upper management in DMN or decision table style. Anyway, DMN, as we all know, currently really has no awareness of business semantics and therefore messaging for the most part. And whatever you think about flashpoints and watchers, you know, in a day and age when you can literally Google just anything and use of natural language, you know, the lack of natural language support is simply not going to fly. Again, that's sort of a story for another day. Now, coordination of responses to behavioral rules brings me to the second big challenge that rule platforms need to address, and that has to do with better addressing sentiment and human discretion. In running a business, it's obviously very, very hard, I'd say impossible, to literally foresee every circumstance that might occur and prepare purely rule-based scenarios for all of them in advance. You know, and to say it in other words, in many situations, your rules approach needs to be as friendly as possible to real time. Again, we come back to that. It's real time insertion of sentiment, human discretion, and common sense. Real time insertion brings you back to flashpoints, and it brings you back to behavioral rules. Now, decision models and decision tables, frankly, tend to be very brittle in that regard. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here. In your organization these days, you're likely to have very strict rules about inappropriate touching. So here's an example rule. An employee is not permitted to wrap arms around another employee and squeeze. And it's kind of expressed in a somewhat facetious manner. But I mean, you can express this as a rule, but what about circumstances where the rule could legitimately be broken? You know, what we're talking about here, in case you've forgotten because of the pandemic, that squeeze that the rule refers to is commonly called a hug. Engaging in this particular behavior while at work, though, can result in termination of the employee. Now let's consider the following scenario. One day, you're hungry, you go to the kitchen for some snack, and you notice that one of your coworkers has his hands grasped around his throat and is turning blue. The coworker is choking and unable to breathe. So you get behind them and you extend your arms and you wrap them around their body and you squeeze. That's an action more commonly known as the Heimlich maneuver. Now you saved their life in real time. The coworker thought they were about to die and is eternally grateful, but your manager happened to walk by the kitchenette and saw this incident, and in short order, you're called down to the HR office and told that your employment is terminated. You violated the rule, and the penalty is that you're going to be let go. Now that's pretty dumb. You know, common sense dictates that the no hugs rule should be broken if circumstances warranted. What's needed here? Well, you need some real-time human discretion. So under certain circumstances, which you might not have foreseen when the rule was written, there needs to be allowance for it to be broken without sanction, or with less sanction, or with no sanction. In the real world of people, rules can and sometimes should be violated. As my mother used to say, God rest her soul, know the rules well enough to know when to break them. Now, maybe we've been asking too much of decision logic. Here's a very important point about behavioral business rules. And it's one that's not generally well understood. So if you're nodding off and a little sleepy after lunch, just perk up and pay attention here for a second. You do not have to strictly enforce behavioral rules. That is not what they're about. They are just rules. And that makes them very unlike definitional and decision rules, which just give you the result and that's it. And then you decide whether or not you're going to use them. So the first question, business question you want to ask about a behavioral rule if you're doing analysis, and this is what we feature in our approach, is, well, how strictly do you want the rule enforced? In the case of the no hugs rule, you want to specify that it can be overridden by a duly authorized actor. Now that's how you inject human discretion, common sense, and even sentiment into business logic in real time. Now the no hugs rule is probably not automatable. And so I'm stretching the point here a little bit on that. And yeah, there are a good number of behavioral rules that aren't automatable, probably. For example, many rules in football will never be automated, probably. But in recent years, I've learned to be really careful about what I say about this. And let me tell you why. Here's an example I used in training for like 20 years. A hard hat must be worn in a construction site. And I said, oh, okay, well, that's not an automatable rule. And then a few years ago, it dawned on me, hey, wait a minute. These days, don't you think that machine learning is capable of determining when a worker is wearing a hard hat? Well, sure. So I think there's a huge opportunity now to use AI and machine language, machine learning in combination with behavioral business rules to achieve pragmatic automation that we've never imagined possible. I think these are really exciting times, and it's a good time to be alive in the rule space. Just for the record, though, a significant majority of behavioral business rules are directly automatable. That's certainly true for URent and other examples we've been looking at. So a unique feature of behavioral rules is enforcement level. In football, for example, a yellow card is a very different enforcement level than a red card, and purposely so, because it depends on the severity of the foul and the degree of compensation that you want to put in place as a result. So how strictly you want a behavior rule to be enforced and what you want to do in response to violations, those are different questions from what the rule logic expresses. So with a watcher and flashpoints, you can inject discretion, sentiment, and common sense in real time into your business solutions and bypass programmers in the process. Now that's really smart. So here's a common sense set of enforcement levels, sort of ranging like no foul to yellow card to red card. Behavior rules can range all the way from strictly enforced at the high end to not enforced at all at the low end. Now, you might ask, what's the point of a rule that's not enforced at all? Well, those are called guidelines or suggestions. And yes, those are rules. That doesn't mean they don't do anything. Now, with flashpoints, in other words, the watcher, automated watcher, what you can do on guidelines and suggestions, which are just rules, usually behavioral rules, you can disseminate knowledge about those rules in real time to selected actors. So what you're doing is you're modifying behavior, you're doing real-time learning, you're disseminating knowledge in real time in order to keep your workers up to speed on the current rules. And that's another hot button that I have, is that without a rule platform really having an approach to disseminating core knowledge in real time, it hasn't lived up to its real potential. Or to say it as an opportunity, we need solutions that are really, really smart in very basic kinds of ways. All right, let me close out by addressing the third point, and that's to tie in more directly to business governance. In order to get there, we need to remind ourselves again, how is business governance expressed? It's expressed in natural language in a variety of governing documents and other textual means. you know, and ask yourself, why aren't those authoritative sources tied more directly into our business processes and rule logic in an intelligent, meaningful, active, integrated kind of way? Now that stuff is all text. Like it or not, you'll never get policymakers by and large to learn a diagrammatic way to express governing rules. It's just not going to happen. DMN is never going to substitute for this kind of text. It's never going to happen, ever. Now, let me just make a personal note here. 2 years ago in Bolzano, during the program, there was a lot of sort of, let me call it condensation toward lawyers, and the fact that they can, and sometimes do, write very ambiguous stuff. And, you know, so we sort of look down our nose at them. Well, hey, I want to defend lawyers, and I'll take this opportunity in a very limited sense. They spend 3 extra years of their life learning how to speak and write unambiguously or intentionally ambiguously, but learning how to speak and write. And most of us, including the PhDs in the audience here, excluding the PhDs, we don't have those kind of credentials. So, you know, a little bit of respect for the lawyers and their writing capacity. I might be saying this because I have 2 sons who are lawyers, but I don't know. That's just off the record. Anyway, a lot of these documents have been very carefully written and well thought through, but there's no direct tie-in to what gets modeled, coded, and implemented. And that's just crazy. So there's a big governance gap in most organizations. There's a lack of traceability, a lack of provability that the intent of policy has actually been implemented in running systems. Very, very difficult problem. And I can tell you who hurts the most from this in most organizations. It's the compliance people. I mean, they feel this just day in and day out. Of course, a lot of managers and executives, when they see the consequences of poor data quality for their KPIs and so on, you know, they also feel it indirectly. And then this approach is just not smart. You know, it's just not agile. So, you know, to close the governance gap, you're going to need natural language of some fashion. It has to be treated in some way, because you're not going to use decision tables for this stuff. You have to have behavioral rules, because these rules are often about people and behavior. It's literally about governance and behavior. And you need watchers, independent watchers, and flashpoints so that the rules can be enforced faithfully and without bias as far as possible. So yeah, there's some big problems out there, and our current rule platforms are just not addressing them. You know, and I've looked at enough decision models and decision tables to know, built a lot of them myself, that behavioral rules, if they're ever considered at all, they just go missing in decision tables in the sense that they're really untraceable. Now, another note in passing here, if you follow what's happening in the legal law space, there's a lot of current interest in, you know, automation of law and, you know, producing legal code. If you search social media with rules as code, you'll find a lot of hits on that. So there actually is a new space of rule-oriented platforming that's happening out there. And unfortunately, of course, they sort of don't know what we know and what we've learned for, you know, all these years. And so they too are going to produce very limited solutions that, frankly, you know, are not as good as they could be. But it's an emerging space and something you should keep your eye on. So let me say it again. I'll repeat what I said up front. all business rules are good, of course, and that definitely includes decision tables and decision rules. The challenge is, as far as I can see, our current rule platforms, as amazing as they really are, the rule tools, they're just not seizing on some really big opportunities in the rule space. And I think I'll leave you with that thought. So maybe we have a few minutes for questions. And Denis, you can unmute yourself now.
Thanks, Ron. That was really great. And then we've got some good discussion going over on the Slack channel as well. But Denis, it looks like you're ready to jump in here. Do you have a comment or a question for Ron?
Yeah, I don't want to take over the whole time, but I have quite a few points actually. The good point, it seems like everything regarding Flashpoint, it's about agency. It's all about a particular role or actor creating that. Would that be accurate?
I don't know. Jacob's done some really interesting work in that, where he's, Jacob, you could actually talk about that better than I can, but to essentially create automatic trigger points, triggers for events that invoke whatever services. They could be decision services or other services at that point in time.
That was going to be my follow-on in terms of, have you identified ways of obtaining the flashpoints from the behavioral rules?
Sure. The way that is done is you create a concept model. You understand the semantics of the rules, the vocabulary that's involved. And you and I could sit down and we could take any example here if we had a good concept model, and we could identify the 2 to 5 different kinds of events that needs to be enforced. Now, the more you practice that, the better you get. You can be highly refined in specifying the event, but it's an analytical skill. Now, having said that, I will also say that it has been automated in a limited sense. Some of you are old enough to remember Usoft, which was a rule platform from 20 years ago. I don't know if they're still around or not, but they demonstrated that it was possible to automatically identify flashpoints, the equivalent of flashpoints, from, in their case, SQL queries based on, in their case, a data model, but essentially the same idea, and automate that complete bit of work. Nobody really ever appreciated what that meant in terms of reducing programmer load. So, and then there was a SBVR model, SBVR, what do they call it, an OMG, a demo implementation rules modeler that did a good deal of it too. So it can be done analytically. And then we have techniques for that, and we think it could be automated.
And the last part of my question, I guess, is you seem to put a lot of emphasis about how these behavior rules are operationalized. The notion of watcher, to me, correctly or incorrectly, is very reminiscent of truth maintenance system of the 80s. The only challenge that I see with that is that, just like in soccer, when a behavior rule is broken and it's a strict rule, the game stops. But I don't want my business to stop. So how do we deal with that?
Well, you just don't define those rules as strictly enforced. If you want to allow your business to slide into a state of compliance, you define the enforcement level as, deferred until fixed or something like that. You have various options in terms of when and how you allow that enforcement or correction to take place. So that should just be a specification. And yeah, if you can't stop the activity, then fine, just don't define the rules strictly. But there's a lot of worker activity. And you and I offline have had some discussions about CMMN and the fact that it's oriented toward white collar workers or workers who are doing less modeled processes. And so a lot of that work can be stopped in real time until corrected. So, you know, you just have to look at the business and what its tolerances are.
We're getting to the end of our time. So I do see that Bob has his hand up. Bob, if you could ask like maybe something brief, and then in the meantime, I'll get Charlotte, who's our next speaker, sort of queued up, but you guys can go ahead and continue the conversation.
I know Bob can't ask anything brief, so.
That's probably true. But I think what I was going to say was that, but certainly most of the examples that you gave in terms of behavioral rules, which were things which one could practically automate, would be things which I would immediately associate with things like database triggers. So when you have a flashpoint, it's basically saying, is the data integrity still correct? And so when you reach a stage where there is a violation of data integrity at some level, and I mean, there's no reason why you have to have everything as being hard rules. You can then sort of say, either no, you can't do this. You need to take some action before this is a permitted thing to do. So, for example, if your agent retires and goes away, then you can't remove that agent from the system until you have actually tidied up and said, okay, we've got to reallocate the sorts of things he does. Now, that's not by no means a complete or a perfect solution, but the thing that would worry me about things like watchers is when you start looking at companies that have got massive throughput, they're going to have to do an awful lot of work if they're going to be sitting in front of the state, and the database is the state. I mean, that is pretty much the way that most systems run. So I just really want, you know, what's your feeling about that take on it?
You know, there was a whole movement called active databases, and a lot of great research done about 25 years ago about that. The problem with trigger implementations in databases is they use such arcane language that it was, you know, very completely unmanageable. And, you know, there's no coordination really of different triggers, and even the definition of trigger was not necessarily just event, but, you know, let's don't get into that. And so you notice I was very careful, or at least I thought I was, not to mention what manages state. Okay, so it could be the database represents states, it could be something else, but I do think it needs to be a semantically robust thing, whatever it is that represents state, so that you can express things concretely against it.
Yeah, I mean, I always worry about systems where the state isn't in the database and it's sort of kind of peripherally spread around.
I'm an old database guy. I'm trying to keep an open mind, though. If I can accept neural databases, I can accept. You know,
I don't mind whether they're SQL databases or non-SQL databases, whether they're neural databases, but I don't want to find some of the states in my business process, and some of it's in the database, and some of it's gone off somewhere else. So I like to be able to say there is one source of truth.
Yeah, I think we probably agree on that. Is a process is probably the worst place to keep state.
Okay, even I might agree with that to some extent.
Really? I was looking at you when I said that, because I was, oh God, what can of worms am I opening here?
Okay,
probably a lot of people can disagree with that, including myself, but I think we should move forward. And thank you, Ron, for good presentation as always.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ron.
Thank you.